drag racing in Oregon, basically, when did it start?
Actually, it started before my time. I graduated out of high school in 1957, and drag racing was getting after it in the Willamette Valley, Scappoose and Aurora, and the Columbia Timing Association, guys down in the valley. I came from the high country, from Madras, and in I went to my first drag race in Aurora. I believe it was like 1955 or 1956, which was an airstrip, which is not too far from the Woodburn Dragstrip at this time. It was just an airstrip that was an active race airstrip, and the airplanes would take off. They'd stop the race, and I was just a spectator. I know I went down there in my 55 Merc from Madras, and so I was one of the elite 5 members of the Madras Timing Association as we grew a club. That when we built the track there in Madras, actually.
How did this Madras club come together?
The Madras Club started as a car club. First of all, it started as a Century car club. One of the guys was kind of an artist, and he drew up a plaque, and everybody had a plaque in the back window. I think it cost you $10 to join the club, and that included your plaque. And then, of course, there was dissension between the two club members, or some of the club members. So they branched off, and we started another club. And the same guy that drew the pictures for the Century Car Club started another car club. You got to remember now, Madras was a little town of about maybe 1,500 people, and we had basically 2 car clubs in town. And we named that the Loafers. And the Loafers, the insignia on the plaque was a loafer shoe with 4 wheels on it and smoke coming off of them. So we joined the Loafers Club, and then went along for a couple of years there, or maybe for a year, and somebody got the wild idea to build a racetrack, take one of the airstrips, and run a race at the Madras Dragway, which we originally had in 1955, 56, and 57. The Columbia Timing Association would come from Portland, and they would get on one of the runways up there, lease it from the airport or BART, or just sneak in on it, whatever the situation was. But they didn't run quarter mile in those years. They run half mile. And these old 40 Fords and things like this, and unfortunately I'd see the cars in town because I was like a sophomore, junior in high school, and I didn't realize what was going on until after the fact that they were there to race at the airport. So I missed those, even though I lived right there in Madras. So when we started the Madras Dragway, we had a pretty good club. We had 5 of us that had been to an organized drag race, and we had 20 members in addition to that just had the desire to car clubs and things like this to build a racetrack. And we were able to get with the city and the county commissioners that controlled the airport. In the process, we went up to the airport. They gave us an abandoned runway that was about 75 feet wide and about 1 mile and 3/10 long. The track conditions were built in the old style where you take a dump truck and go down through there and spread your gravel, and there were seams, and every one of these seams there was weeds growing up that was about 5-6 feet tall. So we mowed those down, and then pick and shovel. All the club members, we'd have work parties. We'd go up there and fill those cracks with tar and gravel and so forth. So once the track was ready to go, and we dug a couple of holes, put some outhouses in, and built a little snack bar. And then we had the Columbia Timing Association. They come down and helped us put on our first drag race. Dave Green was a little bit older than I was. I'm just going to say he must have been 21 years old and I was probably 18, probably 18 or 19 years old. Well, my profession was I worked in a grocery store. And Dave Green worked for he was a farmer's son. So Dave Green and myself, he was the president of the club, and I think I was secretary treasurer. Dave Green was a farmer's son in Madras, and he also was a JC member. So we got the JCs involved in the organization of the Madras Dragway. Come time to buy trophies and insurance and things like this, so Dave Green and I went to the U.S. Bank in Madras, and we got a $500 loan for 30 days from the banker. And
was it difficult getting that?
Well, the banker must have been a good day because we had no collateral. We've all had payments on our street cars, and we all drove new cars in those years. But it was a 30-day note, so everything went together. We bought our insurance, bought our trophies from American Dragway, and they came in all boxed up and things. And we had our first drag race, and my job was I was going to be the tech inspector, so I was working at the scales. We had 2 feed scales, and we dug holes in the asphalt out there and leveled them down so we could get the cars on. You'd weigh the front ends, and then you'd push them forward and weigh the back ends. Add the 2 together, and then you figured out your class, because there was no ET bracket racing there. It was all classes or I don't remember. Oh, then after you run your class, then you'd run in top eliminator, middle eliminator, or street eliminator, the three categories. Well, unfortunately, the first day we put on at Madras Dragway, we're like 120 miles from Portland, and it's early in the spring, and there were snowflakes about the size of silver dollars flying out of the sky. And Dave Green came out in his little Jeep, and he was the tower control person, and did the announcing. He came out, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we knew if that thing snowed out or rained out, that the rest of the car club members would take off like a flock of turkeys flying away, and we'd be left with a $500 bill to the U.S. Bank in 30 days. Well, as it worked out, pretty soon here come the cars, and the guys that used to flat tow, and that's the way you did in those years. Everybody flat towed with a little tow bar. They got up on Mount Hood, got stuck, unhooked their cars, drove their race cars, and their buddies would drive their tow cars to the Madras Dragway, and we probably had 125 cars that showed up that day. The sun came out, and we paid our bills, and that was history.
And that was like the first real organized quarter-mile drag race?
That was the first quarter-mile drag race in Madras, and we was on a different runway than the CTA used to come. In fact, little Joe Allen, we hired him. I think we bought him a motel room and his gas, and maybe gave him $25 to bring up the. He controlled the tower. He was he was a disc jockey from Portland, and I think in those years I'm not sure if we even had a team. I think we had single lane timing. And so we run the track that way for a few years, and as we got into
the first few years of drag racing, the cars, like what kind of cars did we see? Were they really high-powered cars or just street cars? Or
well, I won my first race that day. In the process, knowing that we was going to have a place to race up there, I got an old Model T bucket and some fenders and I had a Model A frame, and my buddy and I got together, and I was actually going to build a flathead C Roadster, which is flathead. And Vic's Motors was a auto parts dealer in Gresham, Oregon, and he'd had this flathead that went at like 130 miles an hour, which was really fast, and I was going to buy that. It was like $1,000. Well, my buddy had a 55 Oldsmobile that had been sitting on the street, and we parked it, went out to have a cold brew. We came back, and some ladies had been out drinking more brew than we had been, older ladies, run into the back end of it and totaled it out. So we bought it back from the insurance company for $50, put the engine in my Roadster, and behind a 39 Ford transmission and a Model A rear end, and we run B-modified Roadster. And probably one of the most unsafe car that I've ever seen. When I look back now, if a wheel fell off, I'd probably been in big trouble. But anyway, we run B-modified Roadster, won our first trophy that weekend, and run in middle eliminator. I think probably got beat. And maybe the reason we run B-modified Roadster that day was the only guy in that class. You had to win your class, then you went into the eliminations. So we went along that way for quite a while, and I'm talking maybe a couple of years. And the race cars that were coming up there, and there was still some pretty nice race cars. Vic's Motors had a C Dragster, still hadn't narrowed the rear end in it. And I remember that car would go 130 miles an hour, and Vic McCroskey, the owner of the auto parts stores, and one of his mechanics, Ron Haas, was the driver. And there was a couple other cars, the Ramblers, another big supporting group that come up. But we get a lot of car clubs from the Portland area, and over the years there's been some famous people that did race at Madras Dragway back in those early years, and we can probably discuss that maybe at a later time.
The when you talk about some of these classes these cars are, how did you determine your classes? Was it did you go by NHRA rules or something like that? Or?
Oh yes, we had a rule book. It was probably 12 pages thick at that time, and basically everything was a cubic inch, according to a cubic inch to the weight of their cars, and that's why we had to have these feed scales out there.
Were they very accurate?
Oh, they was accurate, no doubt about it. And I'm not going to quote exact years, because if I did, there'd be somebody that would talk to you, Larry, and say that I got my dates wrong. And the older we get, the less the dates are really that important. But from the Madras Dragway time, we used to start racing in the Dowsport. And I apologize for not thinking of the name here, and I'll think about it when I get off the tape probably. But Hard Rocks was a lady that her husband, Milt Tumbleson, and his wife ran the track in the Dalles. And of course, they owned the local gas station there, and we ran on a couple different airstrips there. And I can remember with my '58 Chevy going down there and racing, and I can remember taking my Roadster down there with my partner Gene Thompson and a number of people. In fact, one popular car that used to race at the Dalles was Little Bully. It was I think a Model A, but it had a Cadillac motor in it. And then there was another car from up around the Yakima area that was called Who Me Worry, and it had the picture of the cartoon guy with the double eyebrows and things like that. And I remember that thing used a small block Chevrolet in it, so I think it was probably a 265 cubic inch or whatever. He went 114 miles an hour. He's one of the baddest guys around. Of course, that's where we started meeting up with the guys from Portland. And another guy I can mention, his name is Lou Kahn from Yakima. And he belonged to the Playboys up in the Yakima area. And speaking about Yakima, we also went on up. A good buddy of mine, Dwayne Ferguson, had the Bird Dog 57 Chevy. And we were street racing in Madras one evening, and I blew my clutch and pressure plate up, so we piled into his car the next day because we was on our way to Ellensburg. In Ellensburg, they had a drag strip, and it was kind of a little bit spooky because as I remember, it was an airstrip or a taxiway, and Lou Kahn had this Chrysler-powered dragster. It was a front-mounted Popman blower, and it was a single-lane timing for your time trials, and he'd take off on the right-hand side of the track as far as he could get over, and when he'd get to the finish line, he would used up the whole width of the track, and he was going between 130 and 150 miles an hour, and that baby was cooking. He was the hot dog, and he was an Indian fellow from up there.
So there was only timing for one lane? Is that how
Just
this worked?
single lane timings. Went across the start line, and then when you went into elimination, it was just heads up. They'd put the flag up, and away you'd go, and then they'd have a guy at the finish line. And usually that was, if you worked at a racetrack, that was the low-life place to be, was the judge at the finish line. And in fact, back in the early days in Madras, somebody would go to town to buy a half case of beer, and we'd take it down to we had a little thing built up at the end of the finish line, right on the line, and this guy'd get up into a little perch, and we'd set this warm half a case of beer up there. And that's the only thing we enticed him to stay down there all day, and he had to have a flag. And if the guy in the left lane was ahead, he'd hold the flag off the left lane. If he was ahead in the right lane, he'd hold it off the other way. Mid-afternoon, you'd see the guy twirling the flag in the middle. Now, you didn't know if that meant that it was a close race and he couldn't call it, or what the situation was.
Maybe he ran out of beer and
or
needed
he
more.
run out of beer. That could have been the facts. So that was the preliminary starting deal. The starter at Madras later years was a number of them. Joe Quinn was a starter there, and a real good flagman, Chris Christopher. And he would get out there when things were going slow. We were pushing cars down the track to turn them around, to push start everything in those early years. He'd get out there and entertain the folks by juggling oranges or taking off. He'd come to work with 15 or 20 dress vests on, and he'd start taking those off. And he did everything to try to entertain the folks that come to Madras Dragway. As the years come along, of course, McMinnville was a very active racetrack then, and this had to be back in the early 60s, 61, 62, and I know Bill Ireland was the track operator there at McMinnville, And a good story about Bill Arlen. Of course, he was always the Northwest Ford dealers, and had the Fords and the Cobras and things like this. Another good name to throw out there is Chet McFallow. In fact, in the later years, I ran into Chet McFallow. He was the security in his retirement years down at the Winter Nationals. But he had a original Cobra 427, I think they are, and he still had it in storage. He said that was going to be his grandkids' college education. But some great racing at McMinnville is always a Sunday track.
And one of the things you were mentioning about some of the tracks earlier were the speeds. Were ETs even in evidence at that time, or was the bad guy the guy that went the fastest?
Well, we all had ETs was a big deal, but and miles per hour, I think it's just like it is today. ETs was a trick number. Miles per hour added a lot to it. It was always the magic deal if you went over 100 miles an hour. As we got down into the valley, and even at the Dallasport and Madras in later years, the guys started showing up with the blowers on their cars. Ernie Hall, the guys with the blowing cars. But really, in those early years, 130, 135 miles an hour was just about, they were the top dog guys. So we got up in the early 60s. Of course, at the local tracks, there was McMinnville, there was Madras, and there was the Dallasport. And we basically all would race either once or twice a month at each one of these. So we would all pile into the car and head out to a racetrack. Some of the fun things, I guess, was the getting from point A to point B and racing all day. And we didn't even change tires in those early years. I mean, this is before we were basically stock racers or modified production racers. And then we got a chance. We got a little trailer to haul our roadster with, and boy, that was a big deal. I remember one time we went down to the Dalles. Three of us piled in, and one of my buddies had his motorcycle in the back end of my dad's 56 Chevy pickup, and we had a trailer. We were one of the hot dog guys with trailers, so we go down there and we win our middle eliminator. One of my buddies wins the class on his 58 Chevy, and so we're coming back to Madras, and this old 6-cylinder Chevy wouldn't go too fast, but going down Cal Canyon, I remember we passed a Cadillac one time, and we got to Madras. The Cadillac guy pulled into the police station. They came out to where we lived and proceeded to tell us that we'd been speeding on the highways and things. And we said, well, no. I went over and lifted the hood on this 56 Chevy pickup. I said, look, it's got a 6-cylinder. This thing couldn't be going that fast. So we talked our way out of probably a very untimely ticket.
How did the police react to you young hot rodders back in those days?
Well, we had a shop that was a car club shop. We had a real nice concrete building that the car club financed, and I used it quite a bit for building my cars, and we all would meet down there once a week. And it was one block off of Main Street in Madras. The city police, they'd stop by and check out and see what we was doing, and whenever we'd get a new car built or something we wanted to test out, we'd pull it out right beside the shop, and we'd burn off for out to the quarter mile or the city block there, and then we knew that the city cops would park at the other end of town. So by the time they'd get there, we'd be back in the shop, and we actually had a pretty good rapport with them. We had our car club meetings there, and we actually had a really good organization. The only bad thing was we had 25 club members, and we probably had 5 guys that did all the work, and that was the only downfall. But as a typical car club,
some things never change.
Something never changes. But we had a lot of fun. Those early years of memories.
Back in those times, like today, nowadays, if a guy wants to get into drag racing, there's many sources of finding out how to do it, from friends to magazines, internet, that kind of thing. Back in those days, like you guys were some of the first drag races in this area. How did you learn how to do some of this stuff? Where did you find out about it?
Well, I think we just all we learned from each other, and I think that was the main thing. I can remember the first time that I went to the valley to race a car. I didn't even have enough common sense that you need to change your distributor for different elevations. To this day, I still don't know how to work on a carburetor, because once we got going, we seemed like I always bought fuel injections, and I learned how to do those. But the timing was about the only thing we'd change. We'd go out the valley, we'd change the timing. And in those early years, we were so ignorant on how to make our cars go faster that we didn't even put low gears in. I mean, whatever gear came in your car is what you raced. I think the first time that I come to the realization that a different gear ratio would advance your car to the finish line a little quicker is when an out-of-town guy come to town and loaned one of our friends a real oddball size of tire. I can't remember if it was a smaller tire or a bigger tire. Well, boy, that picked up his ET tremendously. After that, we started figuring out that the weight in your car, for a good example, these kids with these sports compact cars, now they got it figured out. They take their front seats out and things like that. We had heavy cars, they were all steel, and we'd have 3 or 4 of us in the car, and we'd be out, you might say, not street racing, but out of the city limits racing on maybe a government street or a highway. And there'd be 3 of us in the car, and we'd look over, and the other guys challenge us, would only have 2 guys in his car. Well, 150 pounds means a lot of ET to this day and age. We finally figured out if we let all of our buddies out, we said, well, our buddy will be the starter, so he'd get out with his handkerchief and flag off the 2 cars, and our other buddy, we put him at the finish line to be the judge. All of a sudden, we had a little bit of advantage. We have 1 driver, and they have 3 people in their car. So we started figuring things out, but it didn't happen overnight. One thing, I know you asked me about how Woodburn started. I don't want to lose my train of thought here. I believe it was like 1960 when Pacific Raceways first opened. And as my memory serves me right, it was on the 4th of July weekend. Me and a couple of my buddies heard about the race, and we went to Pacific Raceways in Kent, Washington. And what a beautiful racetrack. We got there, and it had to be their first race because the return road had been the area where it was, the fences were up, they weren't even chain link then, there was like a wooden fence with a screening on them. And the track's about like it is today. It was a long ways to the track, because in those early years you had to be 100 feet from the racetrack for your spectators. I had some 8mm pictures I was taking there, and didn't really know who I was taking pictures of, because I'm sure that maybe Hank Johnson and Walt Austin and Jerry Ruth and all those guys were in attendance at that event. I went around the pits, took a bunch of pictures and things like this. One thing about it, the return road was not even paved yet. Now, we went up there later that year or the next spring, and of course then the return road, they got everything done. They had not paved the return road. So that's the first event that I went at Pacific Raceway. To kind of talk about Woodburn a little bit, it started back in, I believe it was 1960, and the Multnomah Hot Rod Council and the Northwest Drag Race Association, Northwest Timing Association out of Salem. So we had 2 organizations, kind of the Portland group and the Salem group. The Salem group had purchased the property out there, part of the property, like 25 acres, and had the desire to build a drag strip in Woodburn. And these guys, of course, raced at Aurora and the places in the valley that was airports at the time.
Why Woodburn? Any reason?
It was an airport. It was a dirt airport, and I really don't know why they picked it unless I'm sure they got a real bargain on it, because I know when I bought it, I got a bargain on it. In those early years, Multnomah Hot Rod Council had started putting on car shows, and this was maybe the 2nd or 3rd year they put a car show in, so all of a sudden their car club organizations had some spendable cash. So they become partners, and the Northwest Timing Association out of Salem didn't really have a lot of money. They had the property secured, so they got together, and with the money that they were bringing from the car show, made an investment in parting and building, and they built first an 1/8 mile track, got it paved, and started putting some races on. They ran it and actually I was never even attended one of those early races, because they raced on Saturday and Saturday night, as I recall. I would come down and race at McMinnville, because that was a Sunday track. They had 2 or 3 different managers came and went, car club and volunteers and things like this. And through the middle 60s, of course, Al Beechel was one of the promoters there, and he brought searchlights in so they could have night racing. And they would tip these searchlights down. They'd have one on each side of the starting line. And of course, in those days, everybody was direct drives and things like this, and they had some pretty fast cars. I mean, you're talking about 180, probably close to 200 miles an hour from the north wind, and Earl Floyd driving some of those hot rods, and no guardrail, no nothing, just a piece of asphalt, and everybody kind of pulled up and parked their cars along the edge of the tracks. In a very short period of time, they lengthened the track to a quarter mile, was able to secure another 4 acres, which is the shutdown area now. And don't quote me here, but I think probably the first track was Scappoose, and I'm going to say probably roughly 1955. And I'm not the professional. You got to get somebody like Earl Floyd would be the person to talk to there. But I know that Scappoose, because I never made it to Scappoose, but I think there was probably Scappoose, and that's when the safety safari came through the Northwest, the NHRA safety safari. And I think you can go back and track that. So 1955, there was Scappoose. They raced at Aurora. I'm going to assume that they raced in the Dalles. Then we opened the track at Madras. During that time, White City at Medford, they had a very narrow racetrack down there, which I'd never been to, and it was on the White City, which is right close to the drag strip there, and I think it was a government housing unit, something like that. Newport opened up a quarter-mile drag strip during the time that I was at Madras, because we used to take our dual-lane timing system down there, which the club acquired during about 1960, during the time that I was in the service for 6 months. I was a 6-month warrior, so I could come home and go drag racing. Those are the ones that I recall just off the top of my head, and kind of in that sequence. And of course, we did race up at Ellingsburg, and of course, prior to that, we raced over at SIR. In fact, just when I went to SIR, I didn't race there. We just went up there because we were Joe spectators. But we did drive our car up there, the same one we probably raced the weekend before at Ellingsburg.
And you say you had a 2-lane timing system. What kind of setup was that?
The old clicker, I call them the clicker clocks, and which I have the car club bought them, and when I moved from Madras and took over the track, I do have those, and I have those available to put in our somebody's museum, whether it be my own little museum or whatever. But the old original clocks from Madras, and the old original tree that was 5 stories high, you might say. But I've saved all that stuff.
Was it something that was difficult to work with? Was it very reliable or accurate? Or
it was very accurate. In fact, I've compared them with my Copulink or Crondeck clocks, and they're actually very surprising. They were pretty accurate timers. Sometimes the most trouble I think we had was wiring, and you had to have a can of contract cleaner. You had to have a guy like Mike Surratt that probably kept every track in the Northwest in operation. I mean, every track. Portland, Woodburn, Madras, Seattle. Probably went up and helped the guys out at Spokane, but what a great guy. If he knew how valuable he was, he did a service to all the tracks and the racers. Back in the Woodburn, when I purchased the Woodburn Dragstrip, is that what you're saying?
When it started.
When it started, okay.
Right through.
We started I didn't start, the 2 organizations with Al Beechel and the Searchlight Drags, which was a big hit on Saturday night. And when they started doing their Saturday night thing, they kind of overshadowed McMinnville, which raced on Sunday. And shortly after that, as I recall, McMinnville did close their track, and Woodburn was the track in the valley. And they started booking in cars out of California. I remember the Little Red Wagon, the dual engine wheel standard was there, and a lot of really famous cars from California started coming up and racing the guys like the North Wind and things like this. Unfortunately, it was always on Saturday night, and I worked in a grocery store for a gentleman that I couldn't get off on Saturdays, so I missed a lot of that. All of a sudden, Woodburn was closed. I got to back up. I did win a race and I did leave out another track, Balboa, which was a little 8th-mile track in Eugene, which I had a 6-cylinder dragster, Ford 6-cylinder, and I raced there. On the weekends we'd take off and race at Balboa, go up to Woodburn and race on Sundays later in the years. This is probably about Jay was probably about 3 or 4 years old then, so you can trace back about what year that was. Won a race at Woodburn one day, and one of the few times I was there. As the later years in Woodburn, I'm going to say back in the late 60s, they got into a little turmoil between the two organizations and the managers, and everybody accused the other ones of whatever it was, and got into court, and the judge says, shut her down, gentlemen, until we get to the bottom of this. And about that time is when
Woodburn?
That was Woodburn. It was closed for approximately 3 years. During that time, the Multnomah Hot Rod Council, Al Beechel, the chief of police from Portland, Oregon, things that went out to the Vanport area, which is now PIR. And Vanport was basically a filled-in grounds, wetlands, and there used to be I believe it was a housing unit for Army base or something like that. And the Vanport flood, if you go back in your history, back in the 40s, late 40s, it all flooded, and houses were floating down the river and so forth. Well, when all the houses floated away, it left those vacant streets. So later years, the car clubs went out and started using those for places to burn their tires. With the city council, or the city and the sheriffs and the Al Beechel and a number of people in the car clubs, they were able to start the racetrack at PIR. And we raced there for a number of years, and a couple of years there, and Woodburn was just flat closed. I had the desire to, and through the turmoil of these years, me as a racer, I wanted a place to race, and I still lived in Madras, still worked in the grocery store. And our car club kind of disbanded, the plywood mill burned down, and everybody went different directions out of town, and there was nobody to run the track. So Denny Tingle and myself kind of resurrected the track at Madras, and he was going to college in La Grande. And he had a race car, and I had a race car, and that was the only reason that we wanted a place to race, because we both had race cars. We're probably the only 2 kids left in town. So Denny'd come home, and we'd work on the track and things, and we'd start having races kind of every 2 weeks, 2 weekends out of the month. And then Denny went on back to school, and I called up Chris Christopher. He was working at the Dalles. I says, how would you like to be half owners in the Madras Dragway? He said, well, what I got to do? I said, okay, you're half owners in the Woodburn Dragstrip. So Chris Christopher and myself, he ran the tower, I run the tech line, and then I would have my place to race and get my adrenaline fix on the weekends. So we did that for maybe 3 years, and then Chris decided that he was going to go in a different direction and move to Bend, Oregon, and I took over the track and as a full-time deal, and still worked in the grocery store. And but I had this desire to have a racetrack someplace where there's more than 15 Indians, and no disrespect to you, Cal Cuapama, because you've been my best buddy for a lot of years, raced at that track, and we went to school together. But we just didn't get a lot of spectators. It Madras, a little town of maybe 1,300 people probably was in those years. So I leased the airport in the Dalles, went down there, took a week's vacation, and prior to that weekend, I raced in Portland, Oregon. As the years progressed, I put an overhead cam Ford in my little dragster, lengthened it out. Jack Slavic actually lengthened my frame out to 188 inches. During the process, I was running B dragster, which in those years we were running pretty good, 168, 170 miles an hour. And Bob Beal also had a Hemi B dragster. He was from Salem, and I was talking with him at Portland, and he says that the Woodburn Dragstrip was up for sale Monday night at the car club meeting. So my cousin by marriage, Kenny Van Cleve, which was a pro stock racer back in the early years, a pro stock competition in the Northwest and on the national circuit, I'd already made arrangements to go home that night, load up my stuff, haul my little school buses down to the Dalles to set up all my timing systems. So I told Kenny Van Cleve, I says, Kenny, you go to the car club meeting Monday night and put a bid in on the Woodburn Dragstrip. Now I had researched this about 9 months earlier than that. It had come up for bid. Took a weekend off from elk season that I missed. Went down, was supposed to be able to put a bid on it and actually buy this racetrack. And at that time, I had a little drive-in restaurant. I was going to use it to finance it, but I had a partner. 9 months prior to that, my partner in Madras, Larry Easter, and myself had went down and skipped. Both of us were elk hunters, and we skipped our first weekend of elk season to go down and purchase the Woodburn Dragstrip. And we was going to use our drive-in restaurant for collateral and so forth and so on. They decided it was going to be so easy. I told them how easy it was going to be to run this thing that they decided not to sell it. So the Northwest Timing Association opened it up the next spring, running 3 or 4 races, and they really hit unfortunate weather and rained out and just did some of the wrong things. So I come back 9 months later, decided to, my partner was no longer going to be a partner with myself, and I saved myself $40,000, eliminated Larry from the equation, and was able to purchase the Woodburn Dragstrip. Now I did all this on my week's vacation while I was in the Dalles, getting prepared to put a race on down there. Now you got to remember that this was a live airport in the Dalles that I'd leased for one day. It's a move-in, move-out operation. Same weekend that they had a rodeo in town, so they would only allow us to race on Saturday only. I had my overhead cam Ford, which my partner Dan Olmanson and myself, he brought the car down, serviced the car, did everything ready. I had a lot of good help putting that race on in the Dalles. We had to build a road in there, and that's probably the only thing that maybe I shouldn't put on tape, but we honestly thought it was a sand dune, so we went down by the railroad track and hauled away hundreds of yards of gravel to make this roadway into there. And we realized that maybe at the end of the day that we'd taken some gravel that belonged to the railroad department, and so we thought, well, we might as well take the whole pile, that way they won't miss it. So anyway, we had a beautiful the racetrack there the airstrip was 200 feet wide and a big long thing. I remember racing that day, and like I say, I had a good bunch of volunteer helps, and Dave Hawkins came down, and he used to drive one of the top fuel cars in the Portland area. He came down and announced for me that day. My good friend Jerry Hill and I were in the finals. He was driving the Merrill's Marauder, AA gas blown car, and I was driving my B dragster, and with a handicap and everything. Jerry, I hate to say this, but you remember I beat you that day, and it was a fun time. We all went out that night and we made a couple of bucks, but that's the week that I bought the Woodburn Dragstrip, and I had to have $1,000 in escrow Monday morning to cinch the deal. So it was a very busy week, and probably my best financial weekend that I've ever put together, purchasing the Woodburn Dragstrip. Al Beachel said, Livingston, that will be the best investment you've ever made in your life. But I think we put a lot back into the sport of drag racing at Woodburn Dragstrip over the years, and I've been really proud to be in this part of the history.
What year was the purchase?
I bought the Dragstrip in August of 1972, and I believe it was 7 days later I had my first race there. I hired in a match race between Kenny Goodell and Ernie Hall, and I'd spent a total of $500 on advertisement. And if anything had happened, if it rained out, I'm not sure if we would have been here today. That was my beginning of drag races.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask, back in the 60s especially, how popular, how mainstream, what was the sport? What were the main competitors to drag racing as far as a spectator thing back in those days? Or was it the cool thing to do?
Oh, it was, and at Woodburn they had some big crowds in those early years, and unfortunately I missed that because it was a Saturday night deal. I would have gave anything to have grown up in the Willamette Valley. There was so much. Dave Skeens. I mean, I can start off and branch off and tell stories. Dave Skeens, with his dad, used to come to Madras and run their A modified roadster. And if you can go back into history, they won a lot of races. They used to go 150 miles an hour. They beat the baddest guy in the country, the Bull Weevil, at the U.S. Nationals. In fact, I've got the trophy in my storage stuff from the U.S. Nationals, and I'm going to say that had to be like 1966, 65 along through there. And another good person is that raced in those years. There was a tremendous amount of really popular cars, and unfortunately, living in Madras, I didn't know Wayne Harry as I do over the later years. But Wayne Harry and Coonrod and these guys would bring up cars to Madras Dragway, and I mean, they were just like, oh my goodness, these are the heroes. But then when you get it down to the valley, they had top fuel cars, and they started racing up in Puyallup. And there's another track I've never been to, is Puyallup. Always went to Kent, but never made it to Puyallup. And there again, it was a Saturday night track. The spectators, it wasn't a big thing to even look to see, oh, hey, how many people you have? It was always, is all the cars here, and the excitement in the pits, even like it is today. But the people that come, there was no bleachers or grandstands or anything at most of these racetracks, and everybody just pulled their car up to a chain link, or not even to a chain link fence, but usually to a barbed wire fence. Park your car and get out and sit on the hood and watch the race. The safety, I can remember in those early years of racing at Arlington, Washington, on the airport there, and they had a trick deal. They had a safety cable about 50 or 100 feet off the edge of the track that was just like a tripwire. So if you run off the track, this cable, which is probably the most dangerous thing to have, was supposedly going to trip your car so you wouldn't run into the spectators. Something else that is memories to me is the guys that were the backbone of the racing NHRA. Jack Merrill, the first division director that I actually you might say served under. I should have made a list of these guys, but I think I've served under just about probably more division directors as any one person in the United States. And the next time I talk to you, Larry, I will bring my list of division directors that I've served under or been associated with it in all the years.
And another of the unique things that happen here in the Northwest is you get racers from two countries, Canada and the United States. Do you remember anything interesting from the early years when the Canadians first started coming down and racing?
I don't recall too many of the Canadians coming down. The only thing I can remember is in my early years of racing, I raced in Canada. I went to Mission, Canada, all the way from Madras, and of course, with my...
Was that a big deal, crossing the border to go to a race, or was it just another racetrack?
I can tell you, when Jay's mom and Jay was probably 3 years old, maybe, and we had a pickup and a camper and a race car trailer, and we had an overhead cam Ford in it, and we raced Saturday night in Seattle, and we got out of there probably 1 o'clock in the morning, and my buddy Bill Lutz, I said, why don't you drive between here and Canada, because we was going to hit 2 races in one weekend. So we took off, and I woke up about an hour later, and we were downtown Seattle. He had lost the road someplace, so I said, I better let me drive. So I drove clear to the Canadian border, and I stopped. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning when we got there. And I said, hi, here, I'm here to go to Canada to go racing. And we had our poodle with us. They said, do you have your shots for your dogs? So nope, we didn't. We didn't even know you had to do those kind of things. So we had to sit at the border until 8 o'clock in the morning when the veterinarian got up, and he comes out, and he had broke his leg, and gave the dog a shot, and on to Canada we go. And that day we were actually number 2 qualifier, and we did a gigantic wheel stand first round at Mission, and come down and broke the motor mounts and things, and went home without a win. So
so the Mission bite bit you?
Yeah, the Mission bite bit me.
Over the many years that you have been involved with this, can you remember any one period of time when you could say, like, the glory years, it was the best at this time, or is that even possible?
The glory years is like is 2002. The good old days of drag racing were really fun, but the glory days are right now. It's so much better, so much safer, and so much fun. And I can't tell you that the early years were as much fun as we're having now. That's
one thing of doing roughly the same thing for so many years. Is it still fun?
Well, I hate to miss a race. I mean, I think I missed one race this year, and I find out the things that had happened and I missed out on. So, and not bragging or anything, I am probably one of the few people that has attended as many drag races as anybody in the United States, because I've been to the racetrack every weekend since back in the late 50s. Even though it wasn't a full-time business in those early years, we were at the racetrack each and every weekend. That has been our life. So, and we've enjoyed it.
Drag racing's been very, very good to me.
Drag racing has been very, very good to me. The amount of hours that I've worked may not equate out to if I'd still been a box boy at the Madras market, but
yeah. Any regrets in this sport over the years?
No.
Anything you wish you would have done or could have done?
The only thing I wished I'd done, I wish that I had grown up in the Portland, Vancouver area. There was a time in my life that I think that I would have liked to have pursued this from the end of the driving end of it, but this is as close as I could be with a budget that I was on to be associated with it as close as I am. And I miss learning the things like with Wayne Harry and all the guys that grew up in the Skeens and Old Man Skeens, the neat stories about his life. I mean, what a knowledgeable guy. Ed the Ace, he grew up in the Forest Grove area. And you know, Ed to this day will tell you that when he'd go to Woodburn to race, it might rain everywhere around him, but the race would happen, and sometimes the spectators wouldn't come from Portland and so forth because it was raining in Portland, but it'd be nice at Woodburn. And you know, there's a guy right there that's taken his racing career from being a farm boy in Forest Grove to I'm sure that Ed has really enjoyed his life too.
You've also had the wonderful opportunity to not only see your son follow you into the sport as a racer, but now as management. What has that meant to you?
Well, that's been good. You know, we hated to lose Jay because I was about to the point where I wanted to step back and retire a little bit. But you know, with the employees I've got now, and Jonathan and Chris, it's been a very good move. Jay's come up and taken over a racetrack that has been, I don't want to say disrepair, but what would be the right word, Jonathan? Neglected over a lot of years. And so I'm glad to see him bring a track back, because I've always said that Seattle has been the flagship of the Northwest. The facilities maybe didn't keep up with the pace for a number of years, but that's the way it goes. But yeah, it's great to see him. It's great to see him grow in the sport. And I can tell you a little bit about Jay. Is he started handing out time slips at Madras Dragway before he could even read. So the other kids would read the car numbers and he'd hand them out. So he's been there through lots of years, and he's got a lot of knowledge.
You remember the first time you ever drove down the track?
That I drove down the track?
That he drove down the track, Jay?
The only time I remember Jay driving down the track was one day at Woodburn. We had a 1958 Pontiac first aid car, ambulance, whatever you want to call it, that we'd actually, and I missed a track in Wall to Wall. They had a track for a few years back in the 60s. And anyway, I'd bought this ambulance from the Walla Walla track, and so we'd have our own first aid vehicle on premises. And we had a blue, I think it was like a 74 Chevy van, and we were sitting over at the beer stand at the end of the conclusion of the event, having a beer, and on the picnic tables there, a bunch of us socializing. And Jay was probably, I don't know, 10 years old, 12 years old, and somebody said, hey, I told Jay, I said, go put the vehicles away. Well, him and his sister, she was a couple years younger, pulled to the starting line. One of the adults got out there and flagged them off with a flag because the tree had been put away, and here they go down the track, the 1958 Pontiac and the 73 Chevy with a 350 deal, racing each other. And they were, I think that was the start of their racing career, but I thought, my goodness. And that old Pontiac could do 80, 90 miles an hour. It weighed 5,000 pounds, but they had a big bet on which one was going to win. So that was probably the one of, I don't want to say the highlights, but big concern that they made it to the finish line and got back. But then, of course, Jay went on to run in the super comp category and with some of his buddies over the years, and got all the traveling out of his system and come home to help out, and of course moved on up to Seattle.
And now your track is, we're all into the new millennium here, and you were the only Northwest track in 2002 to host an import drag race, something totally new. Is it the future of drag racing?
I don't think it's really the future of drag racing. I think it's just going to add to the future of drag racing. It's going to take a segment of young adult racers that really understand Hondas and sports compact cars that maybe the older generation is not going to, a lot of them are not going to get involved in it. And then I shouldn't say that, because look at John Lingenfeller. He's been a drag racer for lots of years at the NHRA National Circuit, and here he is in the sports compact, and really doing good. I think it's just another avenue of entertainment that we can branch off that way. The sports compact, I got to give part credit to Jay, my son, as he was kind of putting this together before he went to Seattle. I was a little bit skeptical about it, but you've got to bite the bullet, and you've got to take a chance once in a while, and it was a successful race. And I think that the future of that class is going to be a lot of fun.